One day, oceanographer Tom set out on a yacht trip in the Caribbean Sea with his wife, Julia, and their two children, Cassie and Ben. While Tom and Ben were busy fishing and Cassie was absorbed in her gadget, Julia decided to go for a swim. Almost immediately, something unsettled her. The sea looked calm, but she felt a chilling sense of dread, as if something massive and dangerous were circling beneath her. At the same time, the yacht's instruments began to malfunction, though Tom, focused on fishing, didn't notice. Julia's condition worsened, and she suddenly began to drown. She screamed, but her family didn't hear her over the sounds of the sea. The water seemed to shift unnaturally, pulling her farther from the yacht. As the situation grew dire, Tom finally heard her cry. He rushed to the helm, maneuvered the yacht toward her, and then dove into the water. With the children's help, he pulled her aboard and revived her. Tom was furious. He always insisted that swimmers notify the others before entering the water. Julia apologized, and the incident was soon put behind them, especially because they had a reason to celebrate. It was Ben's 13th birthday. Tom lit the candles on a small cake, and the family congratulated Ben, giving him gifts while Cassie took a group photo. Just then, Cassie's boyfriend called to ask how the swim had gone, but a violent storm erupted in the background of his signal. Cassie grew alarmed, but he assured her he was safe before the connection abruptly cut out. Cassie told her parents about the storm on land, but before they could process it, a series of jolts shook the yacht. Rushing to the deck, they saw massive whale carcasses rising around them. Tom explained that storms sometimes disorient whales, but these were slamming into the yacht, putting them in danger. He dove into the water to investigate and returned injured. He had cut himself on the propeller. Julia stitched the wound as Tom explained that the yacht's shafts were bent, likely struck by a whale's tail. Now, escape seemed impossible. Later, Cassie tried to re-establish communication, but there was no signal. Even the radio was silent. Tom took stock of their supplies. Enough water for about 4 days. Fortunately, they were on a shipping route, so he was confident someone would eventually find them. But ominous noises echoed outside. When the family stepped out, they saw glowing objects falling from the sky. The objects fell closer and closer. Tom risked starting the engine and narrowly managed to steer away from a descending meteorite, but the engine failed completely. The next object fell close enough for them to see it clearly, an artificial satellite. A powerful wind struck, the instruments went haywire, and the terrified family took shelter inside the yacht as waves battered them. They donned life jackets and braced for the worst. A strange ringing sound filled the air, causing nosebleeds and nausea. Tom fired a flare, but nothing responded. They barely survived the night. In the morning, they found a gaping hole in the side of the yacht, yet it still hadn't sunk. When they stepped outside, they froze. The ocean was gone. Their yacht sat on a rocky outcrop in the middle of a barren, stony desert where the sea had once been. Tom tried to reassure his family, insisting that not everyone could have perished. He checked his instruments and discovered the compass was lying. North was no longer north. Earth's poles had shifted, a phenomenon known from ancient geological history. The sea had retreated into former land areas, and humanity had almost certainly suffered catastrophic losses. Cassie couldn't bear the realization and retreated to the cabin. Julia inventoried their supplies while Ben released a bunch of colorful balloons, hoping survivors would spot them. Meanwhile, Tom turned on the radio to send out distress signals. To his astonishment, someone responded. It was NATO, the captain of a small submersible. He and his partner had been deep underwater when the catastrophe struck, which saved them, but all communication systems had failed and outside help was unlikely. He estimated the sea would return in about a week, violently, and urged them to reach higher ground. Julia told the children to pack. Tom then asked directly whether NATO could save their children. The captain explained that his submersible was very small and could take only one person. His partner had already died. After pleading, Tom convinced him to take both children. NATO provided his coordinates. Tom plotted a course and promised to reach him within a few days. The next morning, just as the family prepared to leave, Tom saw a man with a dog approaching. Tom greeted him and offered water after noticing he was injured. The man drank, then suddenly punched Tom, which Julia witnessed. Before she could react, the stranger plunged a makeshift spear into Tom's chest. The dog kept Julia at bay as she froze in shock. Realizing Tom could not be saved, she ran for the yacht. The man pursued her, injuring her arm, but she managed to scramble aboard. Hearing her screams, the children rushed to help, and together they barricaded themselves inside. Julia hid Cassie and Ben in a locker, gave Cassie the flare gun, and told her to use it only when absolutely necessary. The intruder eventually broke through the doors. Julia hid in the back bathroom, treating her wound. The man, ravenous, immediately headed to the galley for food before searching the yacht. Julia armed herself with a kitchen knife. He returned to the cabin just as Julia leaped overboard to hide beneath the hull. The man did not spot her, but the dog did, attacking her and forcing her to kill it. Hearing the dog's yelp, the man rushed out and found the body. Julia climbed back aboard through a porthole, only to fall directly into his grasp. He beat her, threw her onto a couch, and wrapped his hands around her throat. Cassie witnessed everything from inside the locker and realized she had no choice. She fired the flare. The blast knocked the man aside, but the flare ignited the yacht. Julia ordered the children to run, while she slipped into the galley. The killer, injured but still dangerous, lunged again. Julia kicked him away, grabbed the packed bags, and jumped overboard. Ben discovered Tom's body nearby. Cassie ran to him, sobbing. Julia kissed her husband's corpse, but when she saw the killer leap from the burning yacht, she immediately pulled the children away. The yacht exploded behind them. They fled across the stony desert and eventually found shelter in a rocky canyon with a small stream, salt water, undrinkable. Cassie shared the last bit of fresh water with Ben, but he refused, feeling guilty. He believed the killer had found them because of the balloons he released. Cassie voiced the same thought, but Julia firmly defended him, insisting he had meant no harm. Julia urged them onward, but soon spotted the killer still tracking them. They fled again. That evening, Ben found a hammerhead shark carcass and tried to butcher it, but Julia, seeing the pursuer, ordered them to run. They entered a field of rusting toxic waste barrels from the old ocean floor. Despite the danger, Julia pushed them forward. Anything to stay ahead of the killer. They continued over the debris-strewn seabed, littered with plastic and human waste. Ben soon became severely dehydrated, and Julia gave him the last drops of water. Cassie broke down, convinced they would die, but Julia forced them to keep moving. Eventually, they found the fuselage of a long-ago crashed plane and crawled inside to rest. Julia examined their last family photo and told the children the story of how she first met Tom, when he arrived at her hospital suffering decompression sickness after a failed dive. The children cried as they said their final goodbyes to their father. That night, Cassie awoke to a noise and stepped outside. The killer emerged from the darkness, not realizing Cassie was intentionally acting as bait. As he reached for her, Julia ambushed him, stabbing him with her knife. At dawn, they prepared to continue, only to discover the killer's corpse had been scavenged, evidence that something even more dangerous lived in the desert. They pressed on. While Julia consulted the map, Ben suddenly sprinted ahead to a salty puddle and drank from it before Julia dragged him away. He became sick. They found some plastic chairs and built a makeshift shade. While Julia rested, unsettling noises drew her attention. She woke the children and urged them to run. Soon they spotted a large ship stranded in the distance, surrounded by toppled containers and a handful of wandering people. Julia called out for help, but the people, seeing thousands of giant crabs approaching, fled into a container and locked the doors. Julia, Cassie, and Ben climbed atop another container, though the crabs wounded Julia's leg. They watched helplessly as the crabs forced their way into the sealed container and killed everyone inside. Julia tied a scarf around her bleeding leg and eventually passed out. When she awoke, the crabs had moved on, and the children had gone down to search for food and weapons. Julia cauterized her wound. Ben searched for supplies, and they found a small amount of food and water on a corpse. Julia located a radio and contacted NATO, who explained he too had been attacked by deep-sea arthropods. The sea would return soon, which was why these creatures had emerged. Julia begged him to save her children, but she no longer had the map. NATO fired a flare. Ben spotted it, and the family rushed toward the signal. They soon saw the yellow submersible in the distance, but the terrain was difficult. Cassie bristled at Julia's repeated insistence on saving the children, but Julia refused to discuss it. They pushed on, forced to pass through a canyon contaminated by toxic waste. Midway through, a rockslide separated Julia from the children. She ordered them to keep going. Cassie resisted, but Julia pleaded with her to save her brother. Cassie and Ben escaped the canyon and reached the submarine, but it appeared abandoned. Suddenly, a badly wounded NATO emerged. He admitted he would not survive and told them to board the sub. Cassie, however, ran back for her mother. Julia was fighting off the newly emerging crabs, nearly out of ammunition. Cassie climbed the rock barrier and pulled her mother to safety. They reached the sub just as the crabs overwhelmed NATO, killing him. The family boarded the sub. At that moment, a massive ocean wave appeared on the horizon, surging back to reclaim the empty seabed. The wave lifted the sub and dragged it across the rocks. As the chaos unfolded, Julia's memories of the past days flooded her mind. She lost consciousness. When she awoke, the sub lay still. She opened the hatch. The family emerged to find themselves in a ruined city, carried there by the returning ocean. Despite its compelling concept, the film ultimately failed to make an impact due to numerous creative and technical missteps.